The Korean War has often been called the Forgotten War, sandwiched as it was between the massive scale of the Second World War and the controversial and highly televised Vietnam War. And even in that, the early months of the war, when the UN forces were still gathering, is particularly forgotten. There is some memory of the air war, what with the first jet-on-jet combats and the dreaded MiG alley, but actually an air battle that is nearly forgotten and occurred before a MiG ever entered the fray is perhaps a more important, maybe even a key moment in one of the hottest times of the Cold War. In 2010, Dr. Troy J. Sakety, a historian with the United States Army Special Operations Forces, explained the tactical situation of June 25, 1950. When war came to the Korean Peninsula, only the North was prepared to wage the struggle to unify the two Koreas. Although designed from the start to be a defensive force, the South Korean Army was ill-prepared for the task. Likewise, the U.S., which had not even acknowledged the possibility of war, was caught flat-footed. There was certainly a prelude to war. The peninsula was divided into Soviet and U.S. occupation zones after the Second World War, and efforts, first by a joint commission and then by the United Nations, failed to find a path to unify the two. Rival governments formed. A communist insurgency began in the South, opposed to the government of President Syngman Rhee, but was put down violently. Meanwhile, border clashes were common along the 38th parallel. In the face of the turbulent times, both Rhee and North Korean President Kim Il-sung built up their forces. Both claimed to be the legitimate government of the entire peninsula. The army in the South, the Republic of Korea Army, or ROKA, had started as a small constabulary in 1945. By 1950, the force numbered some 98,000 men, of which only a third, some 38,000, were stationed along the 38th parallel. The rest engaged in security details throughout the South. Estimates vary regarding the Army of the North's Democratic People's Republic of Korea. The North Korean People's Army, or NKPA, likely numbered some 117,000. If this difference seems small, Sakety notes that sources do not disagree that the North Korean troops were better trained than their counterparts. He notes that a significant percentage of the NKPA forces were veteran, having served during and after the Second World War in the Japanese, Soviet, and Chinese armies. More importantly, the two armies differed in heavy equipment. The NKPA, supported by the Soviets, had significant numbers of heavy artillery and more than 150 World War II-era T-34-85 tanks. The ROKA were armed only with light weapons, with no armor and few artillery pieces. Despite the ongoing tensions, the ROKA and their American advisors were simply unprepared for war. U.S. planners had underestimated the strength of the NKPA and had interpreted border skirmishes as minor. The U.S. was distracted, preoccupied with affairs in Europe, and didn't consider Korea an essential part of its defense perimeter. In fact, the failure to list Korea in a January 1950 speech by U.S. Secretary of State Dean Acheson as part of the U.S. defense perimeter apparently played a role in Soviet support for the coming invasion. When as many as 90,000 NKPA troops crossed the 38th parallel following an artillery barrage on June 25, 1950, the South Korean Army was simply unprepared, outnumbered, and poorly equipped. The NKPA saw easy success, while ROKA forces retreated, and many defected. The U.S. was as stunned as the ROK. In a memorandum to the Secretary of Defense dated June 29, 1950, Major General L.L. Limnitzer, then at the U.S. Army War College, said that it had been known for many months that the North Korean forces possessed the capability of attacking South Korea, but that similar capabilities existed in practically every other country bordering the USSR. And he said that he knew of no intelligence agency that had centered attention on Korea as a point of imminent attack. Historian Roar E. Appelman wrote in a 1992 publication for the U.S. Army's Center of Military History that the surprise in Washington on Sunday, June 25, 1950, according to some observers, resembled that of another earlier Sunday, Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941. In fact, early confusion would lead to a nearly forgotten part of the so-called Forgotten War, the early Air War. North Korea not only outclassed the ROK in artillery and armor, but in the air. The ROK had a fledgling air force established in 1949, but had no combat aircraft, just a handful of small liaison and T-6 Texan trainer aircraft. By contrast, the North had a small but capable air force that included World War II-era Soviet combat aircraft, including at least 40 Yakolev Yak-9 and Yak-3 fighters and 70 Ilyushin IL-10 light bombers. Again, the North was far more capable than the South. But there would be a difference in the air versus the ground war, and it began on the first day of the conflict. While the U.S. had largely withdrawn its forces and had few ground troops near the theater, they did have aircraft. Among those were the strange and largely forgotten North American F-82 Twin Mustang, the last piston-engine fighter aircraft to be ordered into production in 1946 by the then U.S. Army Air Forces. Designed as a long-range escort fighter, the F-82 outwardly looked like two P-51 Mustangs connected at the wing. But that is deceptive in that the F-82 was its own design, and the fuselages were longer to accommodate a larger fuel supply. Despite the strange appearance, the F-82 was a nimble and capable all-weather aircraft, and some 45 were assigned to the American Far East Air Forces in 3 squadrons. Faced with confused reports on the North Korean offensive, owing to the dateline it was still the evening of the 24th in the United States, 2 F-82s were at the ready pad in Japan. Needing information, the 2 aircraft were ordered to fly to the 38th parallel and report activity. The reconnaissance mission was the United States' first air combat mission in Korea. Moreover, the U.S. Air Force, which had only become an independent service in 1947, had never previously flown a combat mission. While the Air Force had distinguished itself in the Berlin airlift, those missions were humanitarian. The reconnaissance flight on June 25, 1950, by 2 F-82s of the 68th Fighter Squadron was the first combat mission for the independent United States Air Force. They viewed large North Korean convoys, confirming the American and ROK's worst fears. This was a full-scale invasion. The U.S. was ill-prepared. Sakety notes that in 1950, the U.S. Army was a hollow shell of the force that had helped win World War II. Owing to cost-cutting following the war, the U.S. Army had been reduced to less than 600,000 troops, which were meeting global commitments. Its 10 divisions were all undermanned. The Marine Corps was likewise reduced. The Far East Command, under General Douglas MacArthur, was responsible for a massive area, some 265,000 square miles of Asia and the Pacific that, Sakety notes, was an area whose climate varied from subarctic to tropical. The closest formation, the 8th U.S. Army, stationed in Japan, was understrength, undertrained, and poorly equipped. Armed nearly entirely with worn-out World War II equipment, the 8th lacked sufficient artillery and armor support, and the armor that was available, the M24 Chaffee, was light to accommodate Japanese bridges. If the U.S. wanted to intervene in the conflict, they were woefully unprepared to do so. The U.S. acted quickly, seeking a meeting of the Security Council, which met at 2 p.m. New York time on June 25th. It was an odd time for the Council. Despite the communist victory in the Chinese Civil War, the UN still recognized the nationalist government. The Soviet Union was boycotting the Council in protest. And as a result, Resolution 82, declaring that the North Korean invasion constituted a breach of the peace and demanding an immediate cessation of hostilities and requiring North Korea forces to withdraw to the 38th parallel, passed by a vote of 9-0, with 1 abstention and 1 absence. 2 days later, on June 27th, the Council passed Resolution 83, which noted North Korea's failure to comply with Resolution 82, and recommended the UN member states furnish necessary military and operational assistance to the Republic of Korea to repel the attack. The United Nations, led by the United States, had entered the war, but it would take time for United Nations forces to arrive, and by the time they did, the U.S. Air Force was already at war. The NKPA moved quickly on the South Korean capital of Seoul. The ROKA was pressed, and it was clear that it would not be able to hold. The U.S. and other nations were suddenly in a scramble to evacuate citizens and diplomats. Americans were being gathered at 2 airfields near Seoul and then sent to the port of Incheon. The planes of the Far East Air Force, operating from bases in Japan, were providing air cover for the C-54 transport planes and ships used in the evacuation. While the Far Eastern Air Force, or FEAF, had jet fighter aircraft, the Lockheed F-80 Shooting Star, there was a problem. The airfields in South Korea had not been improved since the Second World War and were largely not capable of supporting the jet aircraft. Warren E. Thompson notes in a 2018 edition of HistoryNet that launching from airbases in Japan gave the F-80s little loiter time as far away as Seoul. The F-82Gs, however, were built for long-range patrols and were the only fighter aircraft available with the capabilities needed. The first aerial combat of the war was on June 26th. A North Korean Yak-9 fired on an F-82 of the 68th Squadron. The attack missed, and Thompson notes the twin Mustang decided not to pursue, for fear of leaving a gap in the coverage. Air combat would go differently the next day. That morning, 5 F-82Gs of the 68th Fighter Squadron were escorting C-54 Skymaster transports when the group was attacked by 5 North Korean Yak-9s. U.S. planes were under the command of Major James W. Little, who had scored 7 aerial victories in the Second World War, a fighter ace. The North Koreans attacked first, and Lieutenant Charles Moran was forced to take what Thompson called violent, evasive action. The Yak's 20mm cannon tore off a piece of his vertical stabilizer, but he was able to stay in the fight. A second F-82, piloted by Lieutenant William Skeeter Hudson, pulled in behind the attacker. Thompson quotes his radar observer, Lieutenant Carl Fraser. Before the Yak pilot could react, we were locked on his tail, and so he pulled nose up into the clouds. But it was too late because we were so close to him. We kept a visual on him while climbing through the soup. We fired a good burst with all 6 guns, and they found their mark as pieces of the Yak's stabilizer and fuselage were blown off, and we avoided them as they flew past us. At that time, the pilot racked his fighter over into a steep turn to the right, with us staying clamped onto his tail. Lieutenant Hudson fired another burst that impacted all over the Yak's right wing, which set one of his gas tanks on fire. 2 seconds later, its right flap and aileron flew off, and they barely missed us, and we were so close both of our aircraft almost collided. The pilot abandoned the plane. The man manning the Yak's rear machine gun did not escape. Skeeter Hudson had scored the very first aerial victory for the United States Air Force. Robert Futrell explained in a 1983 work for the Office of Air Force History. In a few minutes, Lieutenant William G. Hudson, Major James W. Little, and Lieutenant Charles B. Moran each destroyed one of the enemy planes. The other communist pilots fled. Thompson notes twin Mustangs made the first 3 kills of the war. Their planes had taken damage. Little experienced a fire in his cockpit, but they all returned safely home. And the day wasn't over. The first dogfight had been low to the ground, below 1,000 feet, but the F-80s were operating at higher altitude, where their fuel consumption was optimal. When later that afternoon 8 North Korean IL-10s made another attempt at the transports, 4 F-80Cs of the 35th Fighter Squadron were there to meet them. The IL-10 was an improvement of the Sturmovik, one of the most feared aircraft of the Second World War. Futrell writes, very quickly, with a minimum of maneuver, the 35th Squadron pilots blasted down 4 of the Red planes, and the other Red pilots turned tail and ran. In this air battle, Captain Raymond E. Schilleroff and Lieutenant Robert H. DeWald scored single victories, and Lieutenant Robert E. Wayne shot down 2 enemy planes. These were the first aerial victories for a USAF jet fighter. They clearly demonstrated that even the oldest jets were superior to one of the best conventional aircraft of World War II. The 2 air forces had met. The American planes had downed 7 of the enemy without a loss. Futrell notes not a single refugee was injured during the mass air exodus from Korea. This record of safety was attributable in no small part to the impenetrable fighter cover with the 8th Wing kept aloft over Kimpo and Suwon airfields, while the vulnerable transports landed and loaded passengers. More than 1,700 civilians had been evacuated. The North Korean Air Force became more cautious, but they hadn't given up. On the 29th, they made several attempts to strafe the Suwon airfield. They lost 2 more aircraft, a Lubotkin LA-7 and an IL-10 to the F-80s in the attempts, but destroyed a C-47 on the ground. The same day, General Douglas MacArthur arrived at the field to coordinate the UN defense, but the North Koreans made another attack, this time by 4 Yaks. As previously mentioned, the F-80 had limited time that it could linger, flying from bases in Japan, and so to cover the field, Futrell notes a flight of F-51, World War II piston aircraft, which were being delivered to the ROK, was pressed into service. World War II planes now met World War II planes, while MacArthur and President Rhee watched. Futrell writes, the Yaks appeared slightly more maneuverable, but the Mustangs were faster, and as a result, Lieutenant Orrin R. Fox of the 80th Squadron scored 2 kills, and Richard J. Burns of the 35th Squadron and Harry T. Sandlin of the 80th Squadron each shot down a Yak. The entire flight of North Korean planes had been downed without a loss. Futrell notes, General MacArthur was forcibly impressed with the importance of establishing a general air superiority in Korea. That night, 18 Martin B-26 bombers of the 3rd Bombardment Group helped to make that happen. Striking the North Korean main air base in Pyongyang just before dusk, they destroyed 25 aircraft on the ground. Only 1 North Korean plane managed to get airborne, a Yak-3. It was promptly shot down by Staff Sergeant Niall S. Mickley, a gunner aboard one of the bombers. While UN forces struggled on the ground, often thrown in piecemeal, the UN air groups grew stronger, especially with the arrival of the aircraft carriers USS Valley Forge and HMS Triumph. Overall, some 1,200 UN aircraft would be involved in what would be called the Air Battle of South Korea. The North Koreans managed some victories with careful hit-and-run tactics, but between bombing attacks on their bases and air-to-air combat, by July 20th, the Korean People's Air Force had lost 110 aircraft. Futrell writes, by July, the first task of tactical air employment in Korea, establishment of air superiority, had been accomplished without difficulty, without any great commitment of United Nations air effort. And so what? UN air forces were able to defeat a vastly outnumbered and outgunned North Korean air force. Who cares? Well, the importance wasn't in the effort involved, but in what it allowed. Air superiority allowed the UN air forces to concentrate on attacking North Korean supply lines, troop concentrations, and armor. By August, the beleaguered ground forces of the United Nations had been pushed back to a tiny piece of the peninsula, the Pusan perimeter. They were nearly overrun. It was a close-won thing. Had the Pusan perimeter collapsed, then all of those UN forces would have either been evacuated in some 1950 version of the Dunkirk evacuation, or they would have surrendered. And all of the Korean peninsula would have been conquered by the North in less than 6 months. The entire balance of power of the Cold War would have shifted. The impacts would have reverberated for decades. It was the air superiority that made the difference, allowing the UN to hold the Pusan perimeter, allowing MacArthur to marshal his troops and stage a counterattack at Incheon, and then it was the North Koreans' turn to retreat. The United Nations would maintain their air superiority until October, when the Chinese entered the conflict. General George E. Stratemeyer, commander of the Far East Air Forces, said, I need not dwell on the fact that had the enemy possessed a modern air force, the whole picture in Korea, from the viewpoint of land, sea, and air forces, would have been vastly different. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.